Shkolnikov. I am with Johnson Johnson Technology Group. I'm responsible for the IoT platform. As some of you may know, Johnson Johnson operates in a variety of different spaces. We have consumer products, medical device products, and pharmaceutical. As far as the icebreaker goes and favorite IoT device, I'd have to ground it in a real use case, and that use case is that I have a cat. And I bet you guys didn't think I was going to go for that, but I actually have a cat, and it figured out how to play our family when it comes to getting food. So it comes up to different members of the family, does the eyes, and it gives us the look, and we feed them. So as a result, the cat's gotten a little overweight. So we've implemented and actually brought this the use of this button. It's a AWS IoT dash button. And the way that works is that it interprets a single click, a double click, or a long click, and you can translate it into a real actionable events. So the way we've implemented it is that when you feed the cat, you press the button, and then the entire family gets a text message saying that the cat's been fed, so don't feed him again. And we've actually used the very same button internally at our office for a different use case, and that use case was we have an open floor space, we have unreservable focus rooms, so when you go into one, you hit the button to let people know that you're in that focus room. So that's my intro.
Well, I'm Ashvin, Mathew. I'm the CTO for Diebold Nixdorf. Diebold Nixdorf is a leader in connected commerce. We do banking and retail. That is the two sides of a commerce transaction as such. If you've taken money out of an ATM, highly likely you've touched one of our machines. We do, if you've been in Europe, if you've been in one of the top 25 retailers, highly likely you've touched one of our systems. You know, we supply basically ATMs, ATM networks, and other kind of systems in retail banking, as well as the store systems for most large retailers as such. So highly likely you've touched us on both sides of the transaction as such. And so we basically do systems, which means everything from hardware, software, to we actually manage it. So we do manage services on top of it. I wish I had a cool IoT experience like Gene, but mine is a very simple, mine is actually really simple because I was going to say my personal, health tracking device, but it had so many sensors that it used to run out of battery almost every day. And if you're traveling, you're not going to travel with an extra set of chargers that you've got to plug into your hotel room. So it's not going to be a personal tracker. It's actually a very simple wall socket. And the reason I think it's cool is, first thing is, there was an entire day my daughter walked around turning lights on and off and saying it was magic. But the real cool thing is you can actually use IFT to basically turn it on and off and do cool things around scheduling, which I find very interesting, especially if you travel, that you can turn on your lights and act as if you are at home. So very simple, nothing really cool, but actually pretty cool. And it's less than $10.
Cool. Thanks. Hi, good evening, everyone. I'm Bimal Mehta with Schneider Electric. Schneider Electric is a global industrial automation company. For those, if I were to give a whole description, I might have to take 5 minutes, so I'll kind of just leave it at that in terms of we cover everything where energy is related in like a few key domains where our mantra is life is on, where if you don't have energy, you don't have power, and if you don't have power, no source of info. So everything we do is to kind of make everything more efficient, and not just efficient, but more sustainable. In terms of my role, it's a newly created group within corporate strategy for new business incubation globally, which is basically looking at innovating ideas from within, as well as working with startups to kind of bring them more from a partnership perspective, as well as looking at more from venture, as well as growth fund investment perspective. So I guess I can't keep up with these cool IoT gadgets, so I'll talk about the uncool IoT project, gadget which I use, which is mostly the Fitbit watch. But coming from industrial automation, we are all about closing the loop. And Fitbit, I think, only takes me so far. Only thing which it closes the loop is when I've not taken enough steps in my day. But it does track my sleep patterns and things like that, but it falls short, right? It doesn't tell me how I slept and what I should do to kind of sleep better, whether I should do 30 minutes more meditation, or if I slept more, that I should sleep less, which never happens, but...
Excellent. Thanks for the overviews. And I actually have no personal IoT devices, but if I bought anything, it would be some of that new sleep tracking stuff for babies, because I have a 7-month-old at home that is not sleeping a lot. So one last thing before we kick off, we're definitely we want to make this interactive and have questions. They're welcome throughout. We're going to cover things from business challenges, technology, connectivity, compute challenges. But if you have a question, feel free to raise your hand and we can dig in deeper on a topic as we're going. So to kick off, we have a bunch of different industries here. Let's start with the why. What is driving this whole industrial IoT, and really what is that for your particular industry?
You want me to go first?
Sure.
So from a business driver perspective, what I've seen, or at least in our industry, is usually economic in nature, right? Like, to give an example, over the last few years, the drop in oil price, which created a whole drive to kind of implement or do this digital transformation. But with the drop in oil price, most of the asset-intensive companies were looking at how to create value without investing more, creating more value without replacing something. And that's what kind of drove the need for predictive analytics in some space, where they're looking to kind of increase the life of the asset, right? So like some of the acquisitions or some of the software which we kind of dealt in the utility industry or oil and gas was mainly driven by how do I prevent or predict the failure of an asset much ahead of time, by which I can actually make it part of my scheduled maintenance so that I don't have unplanned downtime, or in some cases where in the utility companies kind of avoid the blackout we had a few years ago in New York City. That's kind of one of those major drivers. And then as part of this IoT hype, a lot of the companies are undergoing that digital transformation. And at least studies have shown that companies who undergo this digital transformation have the ability to kind of increase their profitability by at least 25%. So I think those kind of become key drivers to kind of implement something like that within a company.
Since we are in the financial, retail banking space, ATMs, I think first thing is we are in two industries which are highly distributed. So you have retail banking locations, which are almost always distributed. There's no centralized infrastructure. This is distributed infrastructure. Same for stores. I mean, stores are by very nature distributed in multiple locations. So we have devices which are both hardware as well as certain software components that have to be monitored all the time. And the ability to use data from these sensors, which are often built into the machines, as well as to be able to do predictive analysis of failure, is extremely important. Just think about it. If you want to service an ATM machine, you just don't send a service technician. Usually that service technician has to be accompanied with someone who has a gun. You're dealing with cash, which means it's an extremely expensive service call, let alone the SLAs around it, which means that if you can avoid a service call or be predictive about the service call, that's a huge saving in money. Similarly for stores, I mean, if you take stores, the ability to keep store lanes running all the time, especially in peak holiday seasons, is extremely important. And then, of course, the plethora of devices and sensors that are starting to permeate both retail banking as well as stores make it that, given that we are in the maintenance business, in addition, that we are in the managed services business, in addition to hardware and software, means we are often the end-to-end provider of that service. So it reduces costs, it keeps our customer happy, and their customers, that is the consumers, happy. So therefore, it's important for us.
So J&J, we have over 260 operating companies producing anything from healthcare products to surgical equipment, consumer products, and obviously with the pharmaceuticals. So from the industrial IoT and from the supply chain side of things, our use cases vary pretty dramatically. But generally, from the industrial IoT perspective, you're either increasing something or you're decreasing something, all towards the goal of producing more value or making more money. In some cases, our use cases could be increasing equipment overall efficiency, throughput, and yield. And in other cases, it will be reducing waste and material and inventory. But the bottom line is that you're trying to produce more value at a lower cost. So the technology and the business value is to how do you get from where you are to where you need to be. Sometimes IoT is the answer. Sometimes there are some specific problems that you can solve to realize value. But in other cases, you don't need to be solving problems that are, that are visible. You have to value in the ROI. Why spend $1 million to solve a $10,000 problem? On the other hand, if you can spend $100,000 but solve $1 million problem, then definitely it makes total sense.
So it seems that there's a common theme that the business value is pretty much understood. But if we look at the spectrum from your industries where maybe an ATM or retail store is a lot easier to have some of that connectivity and access versus as we go to the other end of the spectrum, some heavy industrial workplace that may not even have Wi-Fi. Starting with you, Ashvin, with your Diebold hat on and Nixdorf, what are some of the challenges, where have you made progress so far, and then what are some of the challenges on your end? And then to the other two of you guys, how are you even thinking about starting to tackle some of these challenges where the business case is clear, but there might be some barriers in the way?
I mean, one of the biggest problems in IoT is the fact that it is distributed. So connectivity, though expected, oftentimes can be challenging. And it doesn't mean that you can't connect to the machine. It just means that if you're trying to do something in real time, oftentimes those networks are controlled by the enterprise that you sold the devices or the system to. So first, access to the devices, access to the data is often limited. Therefore, if you're trying to do something predictive, access to data is extremely important. So that's one. The second thing is the plethora of devices means that there is no standard way by which you can even collect certain data points as such. So lack of standardization, the differentiation that you have in the kind of sensors you have to monitor are often barriers to what you can do. So the ability to transform data and work on it then becomes a very vertical sensitive kind of problem, which is both an opportunity and a problem because it means that you probably have to focus as much on a vertical rather than going with something which is a broad platform.
And is that something that you guys are going to try to solve internally, work with a big vendor, or maybe even a startup opportunity?
I think it would probably have to be a combination thereof. I think there are platforms that are emerging in IoT which might be interesting. Now, we do believe we will have to build on those platforms because if you're going into a financial industry, it has a different set of problems, different set of devices as compared to, let's say, retail, for example. And increasingly, we are finding even what I would say, the scenarios that you're trying to kind of address can be as varied as preventative maintenance to something which may be a customer experience. What do you do in a store based on a sensor, and what kind of input do you give a consumer that's walking through either a lane or in a aisle of a store? And there could be completely different problems, completely different set of sensors, and a completely different set of infrastructure you have to build. So it's actually an opportunity I see. I think it's but it's getting down to the level of saying you're actually solving a problem or creating a value for your end customer.
So Bimal and Gene, as you guys have even probably a lot similar and maybe even sometimes even more difficult situations and environments, how do you think about stack ranking the business side of where you should tackle first, and then how does that turn into what you do from an infrastructure IT investment?
I guess it's a two-part answer, right? Like one is just from a Schneider Electric perspective where we have focused domains in terms of building management, IT services, industry, and infrastructure, right? Like so each kind of cater to different businesses and serve different purposes within that domain. So first of all, we have from a Schneider Electric perspective, the EcoStruxure architecture, which is meant to be a platform which enables an ecosystem of not just our products and services, but also enable partners to kind of be, filling the gap or kind of adding value or creating value, as Ashvin mentioned, right? So, but from a customer perspective, I think some of the barriers to adoption are usually the complexity, especially when it comes down to the industrial automation world, where a lot of the applications or a lot of the functions we kind of work on are mission critical. So connectivity, interoperability become quite critical. Like, it has to be available, it can't go down, or things like that. And especially from a cybersecurity perspective, that it's kind of firewalled off from the rest of the corporate network. So one layer is the complexity involved in kind of doing this digital transformation when you take into the different stacks, right? Like whether it's mobility, connectivity, sensing, like now there's so many sensors available. And then you add the actionable insights or analytics, and it just doesn't stop there, right? Like for us, the key is how do you close the loop? So to kind of give an example, it's not just okay to plan for the consumption of energy, but also how do you make it more efficient as well as sustainable, right? Or if we are looking at embedded controllers, it's not just kind of putting them on the edge and letting it go, but like also looking at how do you make the production or the process and the operations run more efficiently. But at the end, it's all about kind of helping the customer see the value, and so that they don't underestimate the effort because of the complexity required, but it's a question of, from a customer's perspective, not when, but just how. Like that, how they can kind of get and achieve that value they're looking at.
And if we think about today, 12 months looking into the future, and also even the past year, how would you say things have progressed in terms of that customer appreciation and empathy for the problem and some of the solutions that are capable?
I think the customers definitely see the value, right? I think, but they also know that they need to take it slow, create the business value, and focus on the areas which kind of, give that biggest impact to kind of start off there. They not chew on too many things, or it's just kind of not just look at the next new shiny object, right? Like really look at, like even just to kind of give an example from Schneider Electric perspective and my role, I get pinged by so many IoT startups. But it's not like everybody is a good fit, maybe based on what they do, which industries they focus on, and what level in that stack they kind of fit in and can add value, right? There's like few startups which kind of completely only look at cybersecurity, or there are some which kind of just look at data readiness, because in our industry, we just have like disparate systems, right? Like where we are really, from a Schneider Electric perspective, trying to make things easy for the end user in terms of combining data from the operation side as well as the IT side. So you're kind of looking at, all the SCADA systems, historians, maintenance systems, as well as ERP data coming finance. And how do you put all that into context so that data is available to the customer when they need it, and to make the right decision at the right time.
So if I'm hearing you right, are you recommending that startups in many areas in IoT really take that vertical focus with the domain expertise, and then maybe in security it could be more horizontal, but?
Yeah, definitely. Like vertical goes a long way. Like you can, start with n equals 1, where you're trying to create, and which stack or which level of the stack you want to focus on. But I think understanding the pain point of the customer from the domain perspective goes a long way in trying to kind of really show that you understand. Otherwise, it just becomes, everybody talks about big data. Okay, so what, right? Like how are you going to solve my problem? That's what the customer wants to kind of talk about, and not worry about the information overload. So definitely from a vertical perspective, and even though your long-term vision could be a platform, but kind of start with oil and gas and then look at adjacencies in that vertical markets for sure.
And Gene, as you have all these different business units internally, how do you then go compete for budget dollars to make the investments required for some of your initiatives?
It's a good question. It's definitely a challenge. I mean, for us, it's essentially we are the vendor, and we are positioning ourselves to work with our variety of different businesses. So we have to bring to the table, in part, an education as to why this magical thing that is IoT makes sense to them. Because part of the challenge that we have is there's a lot of buzz around IoT, and I'm sure my panelists can relate. Somewhat buzz is helpful because it makes people aware that there's now this connected tech that can help solve certain business problems. But part of the buzz is not helpful because it means very different things to different people, depending where you are in the organization, depending what your industry is. It means very different things to different people. So to us, a big part of it is education. What can IoT do for you? Focusing on the business problem first. Then we have to solve the organizational problem, because in the industrial space, IT means OT, and then murky things happen, and things get really complicated real quickly. And then there's technical problems that need to be solved. There's connectivity issues, there's edge-based data collection, processing from a variety of many different devices. Some have, PLCs and OPC servers running. Others require additional sensors to be added and more infrastructure to be built up. All that happens on the edge before the data even leaves and goes off into the cloud, where other IoT-related things happen, which is big data that's been around for a while. Even IoT and connectivity, if you think about it, it's been around for decades. If you're looking at ATM machines, we were talking about it earlier, it's been around for decades, right? It's just, it wasn't called IoT, it was called machine-to-machine connectivity. So some of the things that we're doing have been around for a while. Just now there is a lot more awareness around it. Some of it is properly funneled, some of it is not. So a big part of what we do as technologists is educating our business users, regardless of what organization they're in.
So turn over the question right here.
Yeah, along those lines, the human element of all this, that the technology may be ready, but it's the maintenance manager who's been doing her job for 30 years, is not used to using that technology. How have you dealt with those kinds of human challenges where everything else is ready, but the people may not be so?
Can you just repeat high level the question?
Sure. The question is about dealing with a human element on the factory floor, especially in the case where a factory has been around for a while. Someone's been doing their job for a long time. They've been doing it a certain way. Yes, they're aware of certain problems, but they have processes around it. It's definitely a sensitive topic, and you have to. It's important to come in with an overall big picture of a business, so you're able to identify where you can increase something or save money somewhere, and focus on that rather than on how you're gonna make someone's life easier, because this is where things can get pretty complicated from a human perspective.
Just to add to that, it's not just the current workforce also, right? So I think in the manufacturing world, where a lot of the knowledge or the domain knowledge is with the workforce, and we are at least experiencing, or a lot of our customers are experiencing the aging workforce, right? The knowledge is going to go with them. So I think part of this technology becomes an enabler to capture some of that knowledge indirectly, right? And you look at augmented reality or predictive analytics, it's not just kind of putting in the machine learning and putting a code to kind of say for oil and gas, or for a large rotating equipment, saying that if it's above these 2 levels, alert. It's not as simple as that. You need to kind of know the process, the knowledge of the equipment, and also in terms of whether this equipment is running in Tampa or Boston, the environmental conditions, and how to kind of train the system before it takes over. So I think that transition has to happen, and a lot of it is with change management, right? In terms of, it's a big piece of this digital transformation. Even getting data ready, right? From different systems. What does this tag mean? In what system? Tag ABC and the historian is equal to, some asset 101 in SAP. Somebody has to connect the dots, and I think that's part of that digital transformation which needs to happen get the knowledge into the system so that it's captured and it doesn't go away just with the customer or the employee.
And just to chime in with my VC hat on, that's actually an important area that we look at, which is treating operators as first-class citizens. We have companies like Upskill, that's a software layer that sits on a smart glass for the enterprise, and they have a use case with Boeing where they're not trying to use a robot to replace a human for wire insertion, but rather empower that person and reduce error rates from 6% to 0% by giving them 2 hands and letting them use Google Glass and Vuzix hardware factors, right? And then we have another company, Alluvium, that some of the top data scientists in New York, and instead of saying, hey, we're going to build a better mousetrap machine learning model, they actually have kind of purpose-built for IoT environments and heavy distributed analytic environments while learning from these expert operators that have maybe been there 30, 40 years or used to tuning 300 different knobs. That contextual awareness is important, and it helps, especially for a startup, to go in and sell like that where you're helping instead of trying to replace. Fran?
I just have a question around the degree to which you're open with your data, because I think a lot of the draw for some of these enterprise tech startups, and especially if they're focused on analytics, sitting on top of some of the hardware, is getting access to that proprietary data. So, to what degree are you opening up your data doors, letting them have access, extract learnings? Do you keep some of that proprietary to you, and you don't want that coming out of your own doors?
I think it's a multi-level problem in many cases. Oftentimes, we have vendors to customers who look at their data as proprietary to themselves. I mean, take data on cache utilization or cache levels in a certain location. There is aggregate data. In fact, we'd love to do the scorecarding that you're talking about to be able to share data across multiple entities as such. It is an issue. I mean, access to data is probably one of the biggest issues we will face in the whole IoT machine learning space. I mean, because oftentimes customers don't want to share it. There are no standards for sharing it. There are, in fact, regulations which prevent sharing easily. Take a lot of the regulation coming in EU where, for example, the consequences of sharing data incorrectly can be pretty high. So data access is a big problem, no question about it. When we look at it, we tackle it from a perspective of saying, can we give our customers system, at least initially, which allow them to use their data effectively? And then at some point of time, when people become more comfortable with the notion that you can use data to create insights, and then there may be greater insights gathered by having a certain aggregate of data shared across systems, then it's useful. So I think it's a multi-layered problem. There are no easy answers as far as I know with respect to especially data which can be business sensitive or have privacy implications, which oftentimes in financial institutions is either regulated or even in the case of retail is regulated with respect to privacy.
Yeah, I can add to that. It's a good question. I would say that generally speaking, we don't like our data leaving our environment. So when we have startups or even established vendors come to us and pitch their IoT capabilities, if the data is if they're asking for us to take our data out of our environment into their environment so they can add value there, it's red flags are going up immediately. So just something that's worth saying there. I think as startups, as entrepreneurs, you'll find a lot of resistance from established entities or giving up their data or even allowing their data to leave their environments and into your environment so you can do your magic.
Do you have advice on what they should do then?
Yeah, I think it's important to work closely with the architecture team to figure out where exactly you can plug in so you can add value without hijacking the data flow.
Yeah.
I don't know if I use Mathew, but so I mean, I'm in software. I grew up in this internet age, and it is remarkable to see how open the leading internet technology companies have been about best practices. Like Google, Microsoft, Facebook, they publish constantly and they share what they're doing. You'd think it was like a competitive disadvantage, but I guess the talent is such that whatever their reason. When I try to look at what's going on in industry, it's opaque. There's I can't find any end to see what's happening on the ground. I don't see, I subscribe to Control Engineering magazine, and So, and it occurs to me this could be a very slow slog if nobody's sharing with each other, and it feels very tight. How do you even figure out what's going on? Because Industry 4.0 looks like science fiction, and then the PLCs look like my Commodore 64 from the 80s. I just can't figure out what's real.
I would say that it's a wild, wild west in the industrial IoT. Even within J&J, we have Industry 4.0 factories, and then you can turn around and see factories that have been running mechanical equipment for the past 40 years.
Maybe they don't need more, like mixed automation.
In some cases they don't, in some cases they do. But yeah, I mean, it's a valid point. There's a lot less sharing going on in the industry space than you'd see in large enterprise IT.
Is there going to be like a hunt for talent that might change that? Because I think that's what drives the internet companies. But I don't see the same fervor or salaries, quite frankly, from industry.
Actually, I see it a little, I look at the problem a little bit more differently. When you look at the internet companies sharing, it's because they want to make platforms that are ubiquitous. They're doing a platform play. Oftentimes in industry, you're doing a vertical play where IP is built into that vertical solution because you're then talking about a solution. When you're, in some ways marketing or having a platform, then sharing becomes extremely important because you want other people to build on that platform. So there tends to be that dynamic in some ways. I mean, I'm not saying that's the entire cause for it. There's another issue at play too.
Their sharing stuff has nothing to do with increasing sales.
Not necessarily. I mean, take many of the even in industry, we'd like to share. I mean, it's not a question of not sharing. I mean, if you went to, the point I'm trying to make is in industry, you will also find industry sharing in so much as you want to create an ecosystem in which other people operate. Ultimately, you will share when there is a certain need to share in order to create an ecosystem. But there will be things which are proprietary, which, by the way, even the big internet companies don't share everything. They share things which enable their ecosystem.
But like this PLC problem, all this compatibility that you guys have talked about.
Let's say online, then we'll move to
Right, but like that could have been solved with sharing.
Ernst?
Since you present very, very deep pockets, particularly from a startup perspective, how should one speak to you? Because where I'm coming from, or having placed enterprise sales, I see that there's a huge difference if a solution helps expand sales, market, products. In other words, if that enhances by 10 million, that's worth a lot more to the CEO and CEO EPS and stock price than potentially saving $30 million. Can you speak to this, please?
Sure. So from our perspective as a vendor, we do look at startups. We always engage with startups, but it's more about what value you're going to end up creating for the customer, right? The sales cycle is slightly different, but the way to engage is from the product side or, the product portfolio management or the business side of things where they really know the problem of the customer, and that at the same time we know that it's a gap in or a white space in our offering, that it's good to kind of offer that complete solution to the customer, right? So that's how we kind of look at in terms of where we want to kind of go after or which startups we work through. And as part of the new program which I just mentioned, especially for Schneider Electric, we want to kind of encourage a lot of these startups to kind of engage with us and kind of really be able to show the value quickly. And it kind of leads into the question you asked, like from a vendor perspective, even like our different businesses within Schneider, just based on legacy or whatever, based on acquisitions or, homegrown, like sometimes, our IT business products don't work with the buildings products type of thing, right? But we have a lot of data. And as part of that whole startup ecosystem, if you will, one of the things that we are looking to do is how do we kind of expose some of that data, which is may or may not be, we can kind of remove the IP side of things, but at least give access to data to the startups and kind of have a program in place in terms of 60 days to try and 60 days to ROI. Show us and then you kind of, talk to the businesses so that at least we remove that friction of doing business with companies like Schneider. But that's a goal we have, not there yet. And we are already looking at some of the things to kind of integrate so that data is exposed from an open system perspective.
Time for one more audience question before I give one final for the panelists. Who wants it?
Oh, I was just going to ask you, Ashvin, how do you change your practices for the European market as opposed to the US?
Well, we have a huge European presence. We have our business is about 40% Europe, and Diebold Nixdorf was formed by the combination of Diebold and Winco Nixdorf. So we do have actually development centers and people who have been immersed in, what I would say European regulation. So we do have a base that understands the European market as well as the regulatory environment. So in some ways it is part, some of that is part of the DNA of the company as such. We, by very nature, being very globally distributed and having centers all over the world, we do tend to have people who understand it. Now, when it comes to the new regulations, they definitely are challenging because oftentimes, take the new privacy regulations in the EU, the regulations are being written, and oftentimes it's not so much the regulation being written, it is how it's interpreted that actually really changes the way you build stuff. And that only happens a few years after the regulation has been written. So one of the challenges as you go into regulated industries, you'll find it's not so much whether the regulation was written, it's how you start looking at the interpretation of the regulation. And that just comes by, experience in some ways, some good, some bad. But there are practices you can, I would say generally if you take into account certain things around security and privacy, these are good practices. Generally, they give you the right foundation on which to adapt to, let's say, a very regional regulation. If you take many of the regulations, they're based on common sense requirements around protecting data or securing data, and those don't change. Those are just good software development practices. It's something you would do anyways. It's only that now there's a regulation that puts either a penalty or penalizes you in some ways. So what I would say is many of these are actually practices you should be following as a software organization to begin with. It's only that they aren't often part of your software development lifecycle or secure development lifecycle. And what I would say is think about it ahead of time, because retrofitting it as a startup, oftentimes you're not thinking about it. Think about it right up in the beginning when you're doing the design. It's a lot cheaper to do it than to retrofit it into a solution. If there's one piece of advice I will give it is think about it. Even if it means just sitting down a day and saying what are the things we need to do from a security and a privacy perspective, that will be well worth your time, because as you build it into your software, then you will be enterprise ready.
Awesome. One last rapid fire question before we wrap it up. Where is some interesting white space that you're seeing that's relevant to some of these potential IoT entrepreneurs in the audience?
It's a tough question because it's getting to be a very crowded space, IoT in general, and you're seeing a lot of heavyweights throwing a lot of weight behind IoT platforms. So you're seeing cloud vendors going up and down in the technology stack, where they're offering infrastructure, platform, and software as a service, but they're also going down and offering SDKs for the embedded devices. Then you're seeing a pretty large number of platform vendors that are also operating up and down on the technology stack. And then you have hardware vendors that are also in the space, they're offering the hardware, and they're trying to build on top of it. So there is a lot of crossover. It's a crowded space. I'm seeing a lot more consolidation nowadays, so there's a lot of acquisition where big guys are just snapping up smaller companies, startups that focus on specific areas that are very good in their niche, and it fits within their overall offering. As far as white space, I'm seeing, I believe the next, and this is probably to the earlier question, I'm seeing the next evolution of our IoT and the next battle for IoT is moving away from cloud and closer to the edge. So I think there is going to be more potential at the local processing, the edge-based analytics, the local data store. I'm seeing more white space there, but also outside of the whole technology stack, there's a lot of product-based IoT opportunities that are not tied to a specific platform. They're just tied to a specific vertical issue, like a button for the cat, or something along those lines.
I would agree with Gene on many of those points. I think there's a huge, there has to be some amount of standardization on how you deal with certain connectivity, security, and that's still a wild west. There is opportunity there in driving some of the standards. There is definitely the movement of the bigger players, and don't get me wrong, we in many ways are small players too. So over there, some of the advice I would say for both you as well as us is basically focus on the value proposition and how you differentiate. Ultimately, in the Wild West, there's going to be a lot of movement. As long as you're focused on what you're delivering for, let's say, a sub-vertical, decide what you're going to concentrate on. Focus on the value proposition you give to your end customer there, and then how do you differentiate? Because both the big players as well as other players will move across that ecosystem and that spectrum, and making sure you know what you're concentrating on, whether that's algorithms, whether that's connectivity, whether that's in a sub-vertical. That is what would drive success in some ways, because I think that's where the value is.
I think in addition to what these guys said, some of the interesting startups which have come across, to name a few without naming names, is like obviously leveraging blockchain technology in cybersecurity when it comes to IoT devices, which is kind of interesting. And then, from a data readiness perspective, like to kind of do all kinds of actionable insights, how to make it easier using graphical modeling or graphical databases, which kind of go a long way. And then just in industrial IoT platforms, like some of the things which I've seen, and like most of the industrial automation companies have a lot of the similar capabilities, but the newer IoT startups are, very light footprint, as well as the implementations are multifold, right? Like it's not just on premises, it's at the edge or at the gateway or on the cloud. So I think some of those, like even though it might be an overlap, but what you're kind of driving towards is the next generation of industrial automation software.
So if we kind of recap a lot of this conversation, it seems that there's interest, but it's sort of a cautious optimism. Would you say that's fair towards both internal projects, engaging with the startup community, and some takeaways for startup founders are really make sure that you are having customer empathy around things like data access, that you're not trying to get everything into the cloud perhaps up front, that you can kind of prove your mettle, prove security, scalability, and maybe even sometimes for certain use cases coming in with that vertical focus, that domain expertise. And from your perspective as entrepreneurs, a lot of you here, you should also vet corporates to make sure that they are tying and doing their homework internally, tying to the business value, making sure that there's potential budget, and both for the project as well as the necessary infrastructure at times for certain use cases. But definitely interesting 12 months ahead, I would say. So thank you so much to our panelists.